9. May 1945, Kassel. 1943, Eastern Front. I learned how cheaply life can be measured. In 1983, I will march against missiles and carry a sign that says, "No more doctors for war." He writes it in a school notebook scavenged from a collapsed classroom on Königstor. A pencil stub. A table salvaged from a hallway that no longer leads anywhere. He writes what no one says aloud in the alleys parceled by rubble. He writes against the atmosphere of listening walls and habits of caution, against the new fear, different from the old fear, but fear all the same. He writes for himself, a line that will either stiffen him or shame him when the next day begins. His name is Carl Hartmann. He is 25 years old, recently home from a field hospital near Poltava, with scars on his hands and a hiss in one lung from the winter in 1943. He has a medic's reflex and the memory full of tourniquets. In the Wehrmacht, he had a Red Cross brassard and a pistol he never used. He lived by the arithmetic of gauze and morphine and days without bandages. Now he lives by the arithmetic of bread. 4. April 1945. U.S. forces enter Kassel. The city had been hit hard by the October 1943 raid and by subsequent attacks. By spring, the industrial belt around Bettenhausen lies snapped. Factories that made engines, optics, machine parts shiver with blast damage and silence. Photographs in U.S. Army occupation reports show streets like canyons of smashed brick. Women climb over them in skirts and headscarves with buckets. They are given a name, Trümmerfrauen, even as they are just hands and backs and a patience that knows no date. Carl returns to a home he recognizes by smell more than by shape. His parents are not there. A neighbor says they went east in March to search for his older brother, missing since 1942. The neighbor shrugs. People depart and do not return. People return and do not speak. Curfew 2000 rund. Restrictions posted. Surrender all weapons. Register. Report for work details. Americans in helmets speak a hoarse English across barricaded corners. The fear of retribution is real and also a rumor. Will they take the young men? Will they evict the widow who served coffee to a party official? Will they quarter black soldiers in respectable houses? The fears are inventory, held up against the fears of the last 12 years. Every day the ledger reopens. The mathematics of silence is learned quickly. We knew nothing is practiced like an oath. We knew nothing is repeated to the man handing out ration cards. We knew nothing lowers the eyes in line for coal. We knew nothing lets a person sleep on an intact mattress stolen from a fire sale of bombed-out apartments. We knew nothing becomes the new uniform. It does not fit. June 1945. Ration cards folded into wallets made from bicycle tires and cord. The numbers dictate life. Adults, 1,550 calories, then less. Heavy workers, more. The same men told yesterday they had been exploited by the regime, and today that they must rebuild it. Hunger becomes a function with too many unknowns. The hunger winter begins early in mines. In kitchens, turnip stew is called rubber soup for the sound it makes when stirred. People go on hamster trips, riding out to farms with rings hidden in the hemming of pockets to barter for potatoes. Cigarettes become a second currency. Lucky Strikes have a better exchange rate than Chesterfields. A medical kit in a satchel can earn something if the right farmer's cow is sick. Carl volunteers at a makeshift clinic in a church basement on Wolfhager Straße. The altar is removed. The pews become benches. The first aid signs now sit under a crucifix repainted after smoke damage. He boils instruments in an enamel pot. He lances abscesses and stitches scalp wounds from falling bricks. He writes in his notebook, "What I learned in 1943 I can use for something human." He does not write the other thought. that these hands also gave injections to men who returned to the line and died there. Occupation reports from the summer of 1945 note widespread malnutrition, lack of basic hygiene, sullen compliance in Kassel. They note, too, kindness and collaboration, where a German nurse shows an American lieutenant how to improvise an incubator for a premature baby using a drawer and hot water bottles. These details appear in margins and in letters home. They build an archive of ordinary salvage. Denazification, questionnaires distributed. The Fragebogen lands on tables like a verdict or like a joke, depending on which chair you occupy. It asks for memberships, dates, donations, positions held, statements signed. It is 15 pages, 22 pages, an arithmetic of associations, a catechism of the recent past. Sprüchkammern denazification tribunals are established to process it all into categories that promise moral mathematics, Hauptschuldige, major offenders, belastet offenders. Minderbelastet, lesser offenders, Mitläufer, followers, entlastet, exonerated. The promised clarity smells like old glue. Millions of forms cross desks. People who once smoked in the doorway outside the Bürgersaal now stamp and staple. The files are thick. In the American zone, where Kassel sits, the impulse is thoroughness. The impulse is thoroughness. The impulse collapses under the weight of people needing work to make the city function. Karl's file is thin. He was never a party member. He worked as a medic. He tended to wounded in civilian shelters during air raids. He is a follower in the lexicon of the tribunal, but the tribunal does not indicate how one follows when one is drafted into the army and obeys the laws of a state that no longer exists. His hearing takes place on 17 March 1946. It lasts 19 minutes. 2 affidavits are presented by women he treated during the summer of 1943, when a maternity ward was moved into a basement. These are his Persilschein, Persil certificates, whiteners of reputations, named after the laundry soap. The panel assigns him Mitläufer. The mathematics of guilt balances itself on paper. Denazification files in the Bundesarchiv show the curve of policy bending from purity to expediency in these years. At first, a survey of complicity. Then, a triage of skills. A teacher with a swastika on a lapel in 1938 becomes, with the right affidavit, a man who now knows Latin and can control a room of children. A foreman in a factory who once led a party cell remains in his office because no one else knows where the switchboards are. Judges are suspended and then reinstated because the civil courtroom needs someone who can pass a contract. The mathematics of reconstruction requires math teachers. It keeps its calculus of guilt quiet in the footnotes. The city fills with strangers dressed like cousins, speaking dialects that fold different vowels in different places. Expellee becomes an identity. Heimatvertriebene arrive with suitcases wrapped in rope. Ostsiedler. They come from Königsberg, Breslau, from villages without names anymore. Some come on foot, propelled by momentum and the rumor of trains. Others come from transit camps, tagged with labels and names dozens of times. Refined arithmetic describes their presence. By 1950, 1 in 5 West Germans is an expellee. The numbers press into kitchens. In October 1946, the Hartmann apartment, once 4 rooms, now has 8 occupants. Karl sleeps in the pantry. The woman from Glewitz who sits at the small table at night polishing a single silver spoon speaks of a house with lilacs that flowered in May. She speaks of a trek where it rained people, which is her way to say people fell and were left. There are tears. There is anger that takes aim at convenient targets. Tension builds between the locals who resent ration cards being stretched and newcomers who resent the word new used as a slur. The arithmetic of rooms is hard and unforgiving. 2 occupants per room is a policy and a cruelty. Landlords are advised by occupation authorities. The arguments end when the midnight curfew arrives and the lights go out for lack of coal. U.S. Army intelligence summaries for Hesse list incidents in which ex-Berlin boys fight local boys in parks. Crude terms are thrown against Poles and against Germans from Silesia alike. The categories fracture. The lines running through the city are redrawn by hunger and by the placement of soup kitchens. Interviews conducted decades later with Trümmerfrauen in Kassel touch the same notes, the sting of dust in their throats, the cuts on their palms that never healed right, the way sunflowers grew on slag heaps in the summer of 1946, the way the men who had been gone came back and took place on the work teams as if they had kept the city safe by absence. Oral histories in Kassel's municipal archive record a chorus. We did what we had to. The narrator voice observes, they performed necessity as penance without naming it. That is how communities survive something they do not yet know how to describe. Near Kassel, displaced persons live in camps of their own, with barbed wire bent inward to keep out and keep in. Zielsheim, outside Frankfurt, is only 50 miles away. There are smaller DP camps closer. Their names are not poetic. They are often the names of the industrial complexes where they were built, a factory turned dormitory, a school turned quarantine station. The people in them are Polish, Ukrainian, Jewish, Italian, French, Baltic. They were brought by force and now are not returned. They have their own currency in some camps. They have newsletters. They have art shows. They have weddings. This is recorded in occupation reports that read both as lists and as acts of witnessing. Contact between these camps and the German towns is minimal by policy and awkward in practice. The camps are an indictment written into the landscape. One American major writes in a report dated 12 August 1946, local population continued attempts to trade with DPs, attitudes shifting between pity, resentment, fear. A Jewish survivor from Sosnoyek writes, in a testimony taken by a UNRRA officer, Germans look at us like ghosts. We look at them the same way. That mathematics is not resolved. There are moments of unplanned contact. In November 1945, a truck from a Kassel hospital comes to a DP camp to ask for blood donors. The hospital lacks supplies. The DP population is young. A memo records 30 donors. It records the joke told by a Ukrainian donor to the German nurse. You took my blood before. The nurse does not laugh. She gives him a biscuit. Karl, who rides along with the driver and stands back during the blood draw because he cannot bear the smell of antiseptic over wood smoke, writes later, he looked at me like a person looks who knows exactly what people can do. The mathematics of memory is slow to write. It requires hours that no one has. It requires comfort that almost no one enjoys. People know in pieces. People do not know in assemblies where not knowing is approved. The city commemorates its own dead by bombing, by collapse, because the names are local and the tears warm. The destroyed synagogue is a gap in Kassel's map. A plaque appears for the synagogue only later, 1946 to 1947. The bitter winter. Coal wagons freeze on tracks. Rivers ice. The calorie count dips to numbers in the narrow band between work and collapse. People leave shoes by stoves to take the edge off the first step. Children chisel ice into basins because there is no other water. Allied officers tour soup kitchens and write memoranda that sprout parentheses, increase dried milk, clarified distribution to children under 6. The assistants are German women who know every child by name and 2 of their grandparents by rumor. Black markets bloom. They are sometimes organized by American soldiers and sometimes policed by them. The same soldier may do both, alternating shifts. Karl barters medical services for food. He walks outside the city to a farm in Arnatal to set a boy's broken arm with a splint made from a shutter slat. He returns with a sack filled with rye. The arithmetic of barter is hard, but not unfair in that moment. In his notebook, payment for hands is bread. That is not unclean. 20. June 1948. Currency reform. Posters in the windows of shops, closed for inventory. D-Mark replaces Reichsmark overnight. Prices realign. Cigarettes begin to return to lungs instead of pockets. Shelves fill. People who have hoarded produce what they can sell. The dust in shops is replaced by the smell of soap. An entire city learns that faith is a bottle of oil on a counter. It is also the site of merchandise after years of emptiness. Occupation reports note, with bureaucratic wonder, immediate increase in labor productivity. It looks like a miracle. It is constructed. It is policy. It is a new arithmetic that cancels out some old numbers and leaves others in the margins. The Marshall Plan ships more than food. It ships turbines and looms and the possibility of machines that can pay for themselves. It ships ideas. It ships a model of capitalism with a conscience called the social market, which will become West Germany's self-description, sometimes accurate, sometimes aspirational. Kassel's factories revive. The plant that once made engines for aircraft now makes engines for tractors. The plant that once made optics for sights now makes optics for microscopes. The mathematics of conversion is not simply moral. It is technical and practical. It happens in meetings with chalkboards. Karl is admitted to the University of Marburg's medical faculty in October 1949. He is a special case in a process of making room for men whose schooling was severed by war. In a lecture hall with a ceiling frescoed with saints who watch without comment, he relearns chemistry and anatomy. In seminars, he speaks rarely. In the cafeteria, he eats quickly. He rides the train back to Kassel to help his mother, who returned in 1947 with a cough and a silence about his father's last days. He pays for books with a gift of cigarettes from an American friend who still brings him gauze from a depot when he can. In 1952, Karl passes his Staatsexamen. He interns in a Wuchnerinnen station, a maternity ward laid in a temporary building that has become permanent. He brings children into the world. He signs birth certificates on paper that still smells of mold. He writes in his notebook, "Every heartbeat new, the antidote to numbers." The Wirtschaftswunder begins to be the word in 1954. It has a taste, coffee instead of ersatz. It has a sound, new construction hammered into courtyards where lilacs take root again. Ludwig Erhard's name is spoken with respect for what rises in pay envelopes. Kassel hosts the first Documenta in 1955, a great art exhibition in the ruins of the Museum Fridericianum, a bold claim that modernism can be reclaimed and displayed. Karl walks through the plaster dust and looks at paintings labeled once degenerate. He sees a Picasso that makes him recoil and then, hours later, think in a way he did not know he could. He feels something unclench in his hands. He buys a catalogue with money that could have bought sausage. The Cold War thickens. The city is pointed at by maps. East of Kassel, the border is not far. On weekends, Americans drive to point at the fence with their children. West German police drive past in Opels, their uniforms new, their faces old. The arithmetic of alliance rearranges identities. Former enemies stand on reviewing stands. US officers shake hands with former Wehrmacht men who will soon become Bundeswehr officers. It is called integration. It is called necessity. It is called the long work of preventing a war by preparing for one. Karl takes a position as a country doctor in Gudensburg, south of Kassel, in 1956. He moves into a practice that had been the office of a man who in 1933 hung a swastika in the window without embarrassment. The old sign is in the attic, face down, piled under medical journals from 1927. He leaves it there. He treats farmers with swollen knees, children with bronchitis, a woman whose husband has nightmares. He fills out forms for war-disabled pensions. He supports a local expellee organization in getting a clinic built. He signs a petition to reinstate a teacher who was removed in 1945 for being a Nazi, then judged a mere follower in 1948. The man is good with children, everyone says, and that is the arithmetic that matters. The balance is not neat. He knows that. He still signs. School books in the late 1950s tell the story of the recent past in chapters numbered for comfort. They speak of the dark years and the war. They recount the evacuation of cities and the hunger winter. They have photographs of ruins and of children in coats too big for them. They are quiet about victims who are not Germans. They mention concentration camps in the passive voice. They describe bombings without naming reasons. They are reforms made with caution. The Süddeutsche Zeitung runs editorials that push for more honesty. The local paper in Kassel runs pieces that highlight rebuilding and the success of local men. The mathematics of memory is institutional now. It has committees, it has minutes, it moves slowly so that construction crews can move quickly. 1961. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. German newspapers report transcripts of testimony so detailed that the words stick in readers' throats. Karl reads in his kitchen late at night after his patients sleep, and his wife, Anneliese, a nurse, leaves a cup out for him. He recognizes the description of a transport by the monotone of its bureaucratic verbs. He knows from the shape of the sentences why people could do it. He does not sleep well for weeks. 1963–1965. The Frankfurt-Auschwitz trials. They are held a few hours' drive away. Karl does not attend, he reads the reports. He learns the names of men whose job titles sound small and whose acts were not. He dreams of train cars. He wonders whether he delivered a child to a woman whose cousins never returned. He begins to meet with a small group of doctors and pastors in Kassel who want to write a public letter about responsibility. They argue, they draft careful sentences, they wrap their careful sentences around the one sentence that cannot be written. We knew enough. The arithmetic of public atonement enters policy with Georges Pompidou's visit, with Willy Brandt kneeling in Warsaw in 1970, with treaties that trade recognition for forgiveness. In Kassel, a plaque appears for the synagogue. It is small. It is placed low. People trip over it and apologize. Then they step around it without looking. The economic miracle matures into a social contract. Strikes are moderate. Wages rise. Televisions show the Alps in black and white and then in color. Karl buys a refrigerator and then a second-hand car. He joins a professional association that speaks of medical ethics after 1945, in conferences with weak coffee and strong statements that layer moral aspiration atop a sea of concession. He gives a talk in 1972 about the doctor as citizen, speaking carefully about the pledge to do no harm in a democracy built on compromises. He talks about the way a form, filled out correctly, can be an act of care. He talks about the oath to leave a patient with dignity. He does not talk about triage on the step. He writes that in his notebook later and then crosses it out. His children go to school in a different country than he did. They read news of Vietnam and of Hamburg protests. They ask, "What did you do?" in a voice that wants a name and a confession. He says, "I worked in a hospital." His son attends a teach-in 1968. shouts slogans on Königsplatz, comes home and tells him the old men kept their files and their ties. Karl says nothing. He knows he signs forms for those old men every day when he approves a pension or writes a diagnosis that eases someone's paper through a ministry. Silence protects him and accuses him in the same hour. It is a mathematics he thinks he cannot change. He meets a man at a conference in 1979 who introduces himself as a physician from Boston and mentions an organization, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. The acronym crosses borders easily. The idea is simple. Doctors speak about the consequences of atomic weapons with a clinical clarity that constrains politicians. He attends a lecture in Frankfurt, then one in Göttingen, where scientists once posted a declaration against nuclear arms in 1957. He listens to the mathematics of fallout, described like a diagram of the body. The numbers land with the weight of triage. He sees a map of Kassel, overlaid by radii. He sees the rings of blast, of burns, of the walking wounded who would walk nowhere. He sees the wards spilling into the courtyard forever. He breathes shallowly in the lecture hall. He writes in his notebook, "No more triage for lies." He underlines it twice. The missiles arrive in conversations before they arrive in silos. Pershing II, cruise missiles. A chessboard of acronyms and payloads in which the squares are towns with bakeries and playgrounds and clinics. The arithmetic of deterrence is explained as if it were physics. It is not. It is a policy that leans on fear and on calculations written in thousands and in millions. In 1981, the Hofgarten in Bonn fills with people who want to refuse this calculation. The Kassel branch of the peace movement meets in the basement of St. Martin's parish house where, in 1945, Karl boiled instruments. The faces are new, the tables are newer. The air smells of coffee and photocopier toner. The speeches are earnest. The posters are persuasive and clumsy. The police take notes. Old reflexes twitch. Occupation reports have become annual surveys. Denazification files are now archives. The DP camps are histories. The ex-Beli organization prints newsletters with reunions. The city is full enough to forget itself on weekday mornings, yet the past opens, in little ways, on days of protest and treaty signatures. It opens at funerals. It opens with small discoveries, a uniform insignia found by a child under a tree in a park built on rubble, a ledger with names found in a basement wall. Each item has its own mathematics of weight. In 1983, on a cold day in October, he stands with tens of thousands in a line that stretches from Stuttgart to Neu-Ulm, a human chain against missiles. Then, in November, he stands in Bonn, his coat buttoned tight, beside a placard with a slogan in German and English. He chose the English because it echoes the brassard he wore in 1943, and the English words that filled occupation reports in 1945. No more doctors for war. He holds it high enough to keep it from the mud. He sees, 3 rows ahead, a woman who once polished a silver spoon in his mother's kitchen in 1946, now with her grandchildren. He sees a man who was a police officer in 1952, now retired, now willing to swell a crowd against something that promises security in exchange for speechlessness. He sees a pastor who drank coffee with him and didn't publish their letter in 1965, now with a banner pinned to his cassock. He hears chants that feel like prayers or like recitations. The mathematics of protest is a new kind of ledger, bodies, banners, hours on a cold day that add up to a sentence in a newspaper and a line in a government memo and something warmer, a memory that doesn't skip. That night he writes in the latest of his notebooks, the one with a blue cover and frayed spine, 1943 Eastern Front. I learned how cheaply life can be measured. In 1983, I march against missiles with a sign that says, "No more doctors for war." This is not an absolution. It is a practice. He writes about the patients he will see tomorrow, a woman with diabetes, a boy with asthma, a man who watched a tank roll through his village in 1945 and then watched a parade of missiles on television. He writes about his Sprüchkammer hearing in 1946 and the way the clerk licked his finger when turning a page. He writes about his father, who never returned. He writes about a question he has taught himself to ask: what did you do? He writes about the ways the city keeps its own health in files and in festivals, in a documenta that invites artists who break decorum to say things no one would have believed in 1945. His city is not unique. Essen, Darmstadt, Bremen, Kiel, Münster, each has a version of this map, this ledger. Each counts rooms, calories, affidavits, shiploads of flour, coats on a line of marchers, hours in classrooms where teachers bend sentences away from shame, and then, decades later, back toward it. The mathematics of guilt remains. A fraction impossible to reduce, a long division of acts into intentions that yields a remainder that cannot be thrown away. The mathematics of forgiveness exists in different arithmetic, measured in handshakes and in the way people speak in kitchens at night. Occupation reports turn into municipal budgets. Denazification files turn into curricula. DP camp rosters become emigration records and births in Montreal and Melbourne. The Trümmerfrau becomes a photograph in a textbook that supplies a quiet pride, work without complaint, a stoic posture, a scarf pulled tight. The men who returned in 1945 sit on benches in parks and watch the questioners of 1968 move into offices in 1980. The children of 1983 learn NATO as an acronym before they learn the years 1933–1945 as a chronology. Each generation writes itself a moral in pencil and a program in ink. Each erases and revises. The archive records the drafts. Denazification worked and did not. It prevented certain men from returning to robes and then permitted them later. It turned guilt into categories and then categories into stamps. It created a ritual whereby people could say, "I was a follower," and not be forced to draw a map of their steps. It allowed doctors like Karl, who had done a craft that can be turned toward good or toward compliance, to do the craft in a system that declared, again, the oath in full, and expected that it be kept. The mathematics of this is not stable. It cannot be plotted on graph paper. It cannot be plotted on graph paper. It can be told in stories. The Sprüchkammer files in Kassel include letters that begin, "to whom it may concern," and then unfold into life histories. They include exculpations and confessions disguised as applications for work. They are the country talking to itself in a courtroom. The expellees became citizens who sometimes tell their children two stories, of hunger and of home. The new homes have curtains that match, chairs that wobble only a little. The old stories of places now called by other names become careful pieces in family albums. They carry not only the pain of loss, but also the dangers of claiming too much in a country that had claimed enough. They add to the chorus of suffering that sometimes drowns out other voices. The arithmetic of sharing grief without stealing it is learned slowly. It is part of the post-war workbook. It is never finished. Contact with victims happened in the ways mentioned and in ways unrecorded. A glance in a tram, a nod across a fence, a certain quiet at the word transport. A woman in 1947 telling a story to a neighbor in the dialect of Kassel about a girl who never returned. A boy in 1958 finding an address sewn in a coat lining and writing a letter to Rotterdam. A cafe owner in 1969 putting up a photograph of the Jewish family that once ran the place, writing, "Remember under glass." A vote in 1978 to fund a memorial that is then offset by votes to fund a new bridge. The mathematics of budgets is as moral as it is fiscal. A city can build two things at once if it decides it should. Doctors write in particular ways about these matters. There are case histories that do not appear in journals. They appear in recollection. They appear in the way a hand hesitates before touching an arm. Carl told a story once to a young intern in 1975 about a field hospital outside Kharkov, about a boy soldier with a chest wound who died because the IV froze. He told it without commentary, as if it were a medical fact. He did not say what it taught him. He did not need to. The arithmetic of that story is the underpinning of his sign in 1983. It is this: systems that treat people as numbers will ask doctors to do the same. Refuse. Say it out loud. He reads Bund archives. Bund does archive entries when he has chance. He learns to read the grey between the lines of reports that say order maintained at rally and 5 arrests. He reads Allied intelligence summaries from 1945 to 1946 that talk of denial among population, and he scribbles in the margins of copies, not denial, fear of speech, near to denial. He is precise because precision is his second language, medicine his first. He uses the exact name for things. He expects the same of his country. There are rubber stamps on documents from 1945 that say suitable. There are stamps in 1969 that say closed. There are stamps in 1983 that say approved. The front line after 1945 is a counter with a clerk who asks questions. Name, address, association, purpose. The answer to the last fills in the blank for the first three. The arithmetic of democracy is a form. The notebooks accumulate. The first in 1945 with the line that endangered him only in his mind. Others through the years with lines that were dangerous only because of what they implied about a man's willingness to inhabit memory instead of leaving it behind. He could not say some of them aloud in 1946 because a neighbor would have looked at him askance, marking him as a man who thought too much in a time of necessity. He could say some of them aloud in 1965, but the words would fall flat among men who had built new lives and did not want the old calculations reopened. He can say them in 1983. He does not take the microphone. He holds a sign. He walks. He remembers the city in intervals. He remembers a woman with dust in her hair lifting a brick and putting it on a pile over and over again. He remembers a US sergeant who took a splinter out of a boy's hand and smiled, a human without a uniform for a moment. He remembers the warmth of a stove on a day when the window glass was lined with frost-like lace. He remembers writing down a man's occupation on a form and thinking about how the word bookkeeper contained more honesty than some political declarations. He remembers the taste of soup brought by a neighbor in 1946 and the bitterness when the neighbor moved out in 1950 and never spoke to his mother again. He remembers the train past the fence east of Kassel. He remembers a painting in 1955 that was all jagged shape and blue that cut him and healed him in the same minute. The arithmetic of food. The arithmetic of guilt. The arithmetic of rooms. The arithmetic of forgetting, which is an arithmetic only in the sense that it recurs. The city's ledger toggles among these. Pages in 1945 list attendees to trial. Among these in 1946 list households and their occupants. Pages in 1947 list sentences and their lengths, and then, in pencil, their reductions. Pages in 1948 list inventory. Pages in 1955 list exhibitions. Pages in 1960. Pages in 1972 list medical talk titles. Pages in 1983 list names of signatories. These are the city's breaths. Documents record individual words inside them that say more than the headnotes. A Sprüchkammer file includes a note, applicant brought jam. An occupation report says, German doctor competent, reticent. A letter from a displaced person to a house in Kassel says, we lived there. Please advise if any letters arrive. A memo from a minister in 1951 says, be cautious, teachers. Need experienced staff. A municipal report in 1977 says, plaque synagogue defaced, cleaned. An intelligence summary in 1981 says, peace movement middle class. A police report in 1983 says, demonstration peaceful. Many doctors present. That last line comforts him. It says, we have learned a different oath. His last entry for November 1983. The war after the war is a doctor's war. It is fought with files. It is triage after triage, determining which memory to treat first, which wound can wait, which must be left to scar. It is not heroism. It is a practice. He writes it knowing that the arithmetic of his life adds up to many sums, that math teachers in the city have taught children how to row,